She
Well,
had seen something that she wasn't allowed to see. Something had been let into her world that wasn't there before. After that, every evening, even though she was an obedient child, she crept over to the window to watch the yellow dress drift across the cobblestones in all kinds of weather, but always with an inexpressibly sweet and secretive air, and always accompanied by that mysterious umbrella, visible or invisible, depending on if it was raining or not. The vision had nothing to do with the sleepy face that appeared in the neighbor's doorframe when Helga knocked to borrow a bit of margarine or flour for her mother, who was always short on the most important ingredient when she was making gravy. And it made no noticeable difference when, one day, the neighbor moved away. For a long time, the child still waited at the window for that yellow dress and the buoyant, translucent umbrella. When this nightly passage through the darkening courtyard stopped, she had just shut her eyes and listened to the rain splashing against something taut, silky, and more distant than all her childhood sounds and smells. Helga and Egon moved into a two-room apartment that was familiar to her parents, similar to her parents, and wasn't far away either. But it was at the street level, and an old wish of Helga's was fulfilled. Now that she could sit in her own house and look out at the traffic, she had what she'd never had before: time. And since idleness is the root of all evil, she was easy prey for sayings like that. This gave her a slightly guilty conscience, not toward her husband who provided for her, but just in general. She allowed herself to become a gentle, self effacing individual. She exaggerated the few responsibilities she had and emphasized her frequent visits to her parents and their visits to her. Her in laws lived in the country, and she wrote to them often, though she had met them only at the wedding. Her letters, which contained detailed accounts of how she spent her day doing domestic duties and got the most out of Egon's salary for everyone's benefit, always ended monotonously with these lines: "We are both well and hope the same for you. Your devoted daughter in law, Helga." Every morning, she and her mother went shopping, each with a headscarf and sturdy shopping bag. Her mother shopped for the best cuts of meat at the butcher. Men who worked hard needed solid meals, she explained. Helga served a solid meal for her husband at precisely 6 o'clock every evening. But from the moment he left the morning until that hour, she rarely thought of him. When the shopping and cleaning were done, she sat at the window with some darning that was meant to distract her from the fact that she was sitting there idly, while the people in the street all seemed to have so much to do. From her protected, hidden spot behind the curtain, she observed them with interest, seriousness, the way she had before Egon observed all men with brown eyes. She was filled with vague curiosity. Where were they going? Why were they so busy? Although she didn't realize it, she was lonely. She often thought about her mother because, in Helga's eyes, her mother was a person who, unlike everyone else, never changed. It was a kind of respite for Helga to be with her mother, mother and child, comfort. She loved recalling her childhood. She liked hearing her mother talk about things that had happened. Her mother talked a lot. The sentences streamed from her, forming sturdy frames around distant, blurry landscapes. Often she said, "You are doing so well. You should appreciate it more, but now you've always been ungrateful." "Ungrateful? How?" Helga asked. Then every time she got the story about all the tears she had shed when she received gifts, "In the end, we were simply afraid to buy you anything," her mother said. And there in the twilight, they sat, shaking their heads at the thought of this unappreciative child who had cried over gifts that would have delighted other children. They talked about the mystery in the same tone one might talk about getting scarlet fever. "Good heavens, you were so sick. We thought you might never get over it." Most of all, Helga loved hearing about everything that was outside the parameters of her own memory, about the first words she'd spoken, when she'd been toilet trained and so on, things that did not differentiate her from any other child a mother might talk about. Her mother liked to end the stories while getting up and gathering her belongings by making some remark like, "Well, we won't be seeing those times again." Generalization spoken without the slightest tone of complaint that left a small rip in the veil that lay over Helga's innermost being like the membrane around an unborn child. When her mother left, always soon before Egon was expected home, Helga waved to her substantial figure for as long as she could. She sat back on the window without turning on the light. A sadness grew within her and around her. She thought if only Egon would come home. But when he did and filled the small rooms with his noisy company, every enchantment was shattered. Could it be that it wasn't him she was longing for? She walked around quietly, carrying out her housewifely duties, picked at her food like a bird, and said yes, no, when her husband's remark required an answer. Once he regarded her closely. "You should have a kid," he said. I damn well don't understand why it's not happening." Then she blushed, partly at her deficiency in that department, but more because she didn't actually mind not having a child. Her togetherness with her mother allowed the child in Helga to live on within her, and it was as if there wasn't room for another one. Sometimes she lied to Egon when he asked if her mother had been over, because for some reason he didn't like her mother to visit her so often when he wasn't home. The days passed without much to distinguish one from the next. One evening, Helga had the food waiting for an hour before Egon came home, and when he did arrive, he was drunk. He threw himself down on the divan, from which her movements through the living room with a furtive, sinister glance. "What's wrong with you?" he asked suddenly. "Your face looks all pasty." She was shocked and quickly put on some rouge on her cheeks. But later she got used to his tone. She also got used to making food that was easily reheated because it was impossible to predict when he would come home. She told her mother, "Egon has started drinking." Her mother seemed to be more uneasy about it than Helga was. "When a man drinks, it's because he's dissatisfied with his wife," she declared. And since she was of the opinion that you could always do something about a problem, she advised her daughter to talk it out with Egon and figure out what was the matter. But Helga never tried to put herself in another person's shoes. It had never been necessary. Her entire character consisted of a pile of memories without a pattern or plan. There were a number of pairs of brown eyes, a twilight mood, an immense undefined expectation, a yellow dress, and an umbrella. There were tears and disappointments and so many other things and small joys in between. And there was a man who had opened her narrow, pale lips for a few moments and made her feel the tug of something unknown and wonderful. There was a voice that said strange and sweet words to her. And over it all stretched the fine silk umbrella canopy of childhood and her dreams. This had nothing to do with the man who had started drinking. She thought she had given him as much of herself as he could reasonably expect, and her vague feeling of inadequacy with him was only because she wasn't pregnant, as a newly married wife ought to be. But it seemed to her as usual, she expected something more for herself, a kind of surfeit that went only to other unknown individuals. Not that she blamed anyone for anything, she had never done that, but because she knew how unreasonable she was. She had written things on her life's wish list that were achievable. Time to dream, a husband with brown eyes, and a child. Well, the last one was just for conventional reasons. Her outward behavior had always been dictated by tangible things, so she assumed that it was something concrete that made Egon started drinking and speak harshly to her. She nodded thoughtfully to her mother over tea and promised to talk it out with her husband. But she had already decided that it was the lack of a child that was bothering him and matters no one could do anything about were not proper topics of conversation, not even with her mother. That evening, Egon came home at midnight. He threw his dirty overalls in the middle of the living room and called for Helga, who was warming up his food. "I'm fed up to here with it," he said, swaying on his legs like a sailor. She disappeared into the kitchen, staring at him with sorrowful, wondering eyes. "What are you fed up with?" she asked anxiously. "Everything," he said, alcohol on his breath. "What do you think I am, an idiot?" She didn't answer, but pulled back from him a step. Her mind was slow, never fully able to follow a situation, especially a surprising one. Her mind quickened only with memories. "The food is burning," she said hesitantly. He laughed callously. "I don't want any food. I already ate." "Where did you eat?" she asked quietly, untying her apron. Her hands trembled. He could see that she was hurt or afraid, and he laughed loudly again. "With a good-looking girl, if you absolutely must know," he shouted triumphantly. And then he belched in her face and walked into the bedroom and lay down on the bed, fully dressed. Helga followed him. She looked at him, confused, numb to any clear thought or feeling. As she fumbled for a safe, childlike footing, she whispered, "I'm going to tell my mother." But he was already asleep. Actually, she didn't feel any more hurt by the thought that he had very likely cheated on her than she knew a person ought to feel. A husband shouldn't drink, but if he cheats, that's much worse. Instead of having her usual fantasies, she imagined him with another woman, but it really didn't make much difference. It was only her outer life that he threatened. It didn't change who she was. Her body was the same as before, with one small distinction. It had lessened in value to other men. The term "other men" hadn't occurred to her since she'd gotten married. Now, as she slowly undressed, she thought only about that, because she knew her mother would. Her mother would rationalize that if this husband neglected his obligations, that she would have to turn to other brown-eyed men for the pursuit of her daily bread. This idea that men absolutely have to have brown eyes came, by the way, from her mother. A mark that had struck. Dark men are goodness itself. Egon slept heavily beside her, and Helga lay observing him despite the late hour. She wasn't sleepy. His chin was relaxed, he had a beard, and he was snoring. This was how one might think about a stranger, not about one's husband. Maybe he had become a stranger for her for quite some time, ever since the day she had gone with him with such high expectations and departed with such a deep disappointment in her own quiet way without acknowledging it as with any great calamity. What does one person mean to another except when one forces the other to act? Helga's reaction was strange. The times she'd stolen a small amount of household money and hidden it in a box, originally a jewelry box she'd been given for her confirmation, she didn't have any purpose in mind. Perhaps she tried to convince herself it was for a Christmas gift or other things she would struggle to afford. But now she realized why she saved the money. She suddenly, in the dark, and very quietly slipped out of bed, walked to the drawer where she had hidden the box. The moon lit the little room like a false dawn. With the deftness of a thief, she counted the money. There were almost 40 kroner. She held them in her hands, smiled gently, redeemed and alone, like a child smiling in her sleep. All she could think of was an open, translucent umbrella of a certain shape and color. She longed for the morning, and her heart pounded fast, the way a woman's heart pounds when she's going to meet her lover. She imagined the street in the rain and herself wandering beneath the silken canopy. Vague, bright thoughts spread like dandelion tufts across her mind. The house where she had worked, a wife in a dinner dress. Oh, Helga, bring me my umbrella. She had held many umbrellas in her hand, and without thinking about them, things outside her world didn't really mean anything to her now until she acted. She got back into bed, and her husband reached for her body in his sleep, mumbling something she couldn't even make out. Carefully, she laid his limp hand back under the comforter. A distant tenderness flowed through her. For a second, she felt as much searing emotion as one could ever feel for another person, except for her mother. Recently, Egon had often yelled about getting a divorce and said he wasn't going to be married to a broom handle. The words stung at her. The words he slung at her passed right through her as if she were a seed. Her parents always yelled like that when they fought. It didn't mean anything, and she was used to it. All that mattered was that the neighbors didn't hear. She was never one to argue. She just figured that other people were like that, but she wasn't. She defended it another way. There was no way of knowing when it would surface. Maybe Egon had never cheated on her at all, but that didn't matter anymore. The next morning, they both acted as if nothing had happened. That's how their lives were. Helga prepared her husband's lunch, made him coffee, and kissed him on the cheek as he left, exactly as usual. Then she went shopping, filled with a light, expectant series of thoughts. There was no one to tell her that she looked beautiful in the morning, in the way perfectly regular people can, once in a while when they're feeling happy. She brightened the November day like a pale, delicate morning star, trembling gently and devoted before it's extinguished. She wasn't the same person that she was the day before. She was a woman walking into shops looking at umbrellas. It took a long time to find the right one. She carried it awkwardly on the way home, like a man who isn't used to carrying a bouquet of flowers. Once inside, she opened the umbrella and skipped around the apartment with it. Her joy was pristine. She walked exactly like the woman in the yellow dress from her childhood. She walked past piles of dirty dishes, through large, well-lit rooms with palm trees in corners, paintings on the walls. She entered an illuminated ballroom and remembered her first dance. She lifted the hem of her invisible dress and danced a few steps. The shaft of the umbrella was cool, thin, and strong, something to hold lightly, tightly, something to admire, to believe in, to acknowledge. Now she could say to her girlfriends, I bought an umbrella, and it would still be all hers. She closed it, studying the way it functioned, the shiny ribs, the tiny, adorable silk buttons, and the durable yet translucent cloth against which the rain would someday thrum its melody of forgotten and lost times. Her ecstasy lasted most of the day. She didn't even think about her mother. She didn't clean. She didn't dust the furniture. She didn't think of Egon either. When he returned unexpectedly straight from work, she was sitting in the window at her usual spot with the darning basket, which was empty, in front of her. She smiled and looked up at him. I haven't made dinner, she said offhandedly, adding as a provocation, which was unlike her, I thought maybe you would be eating out. He didn't answer. She ascertained that he was sober and he was trying to avoid her eyes. Why? She wanted to tell him about the umbrella and her little swindle. She needed to share her joy with someone, but he looked so terribly ceremoniously as he sat at the table and cleared his throat. I'm sorry about yesterday, he said awkwardly. It wasn't true. I was just drunk. I see, she said flatly. All day she hadn't given one thought to what had happened the day before. Even now it was strangely difficult for her to think about anything other than the umbrella, but the situation demanded that she say something. She felt embarrassed, as he did, and she stared down at her hands. Well, that's all right, she said truthfully. I've forgotten all about it. She didn't notice the shadow darkening on his face, and she didn't register how despairingly he tensed his whole body towards her. She was a person who didn't come when she was called. She was the one who called when she needed something in a thin voice, which was easily drowned out by a storm. Besides, it's very rare that two people call at the same time and get responses. She was content in herself. She even had a bit of extra to share, but her husband had pursued her for a long time like a big clumsy animal, while she, agile and light as a scared gazelle, had run from him into the bright, hidden clearing in the woods. She sat down across from him, small and erect, and again seemed to him both secretive and alluring. As long as he had a long time ago, he asked jealously and fearfully, "What are you thinking about?" And just like back then, her clear, dreamy eyes glided over him as she responded, "An umbrella." And then with a sudden animation, "I bought it, Egon. Do you want to see it?" She was already skipping to the entryway, breathless with excitement. He followed behind her and abruptly, angrily pulled the fine object from her hands and broke it in half over his strong knee. "There's your umbrella," he shouted. She stood there for a second in shock, staring at the pieces, at the cleverly formed ribs and the torn silk. She walked silently past him into the little living room, back to the manageable, tolerable, the predetermined. She sat by the window as before, finally realizing that this was her place and that everything was the way it was supposed to be. The colors in her memory mixed together, forming the beginning of a kind of pattern. She realized that she could never be the owner of an umbrella. It was only natural, it only made sense that the umbrella was ruined. She had set herself up against the secret law steering her inner world. Few people, even once in their life, dare to make the inexpressible real. Helga smiled distantly at her husband. It was as if he had caused some string inside her to vibrate silently, maybe because he had shown her the limits of her potential before it flowed out into nothingness. She didn't think about it like that. She just thought, this is exactly as if I had cheated on him, and he's forgiven me. But she nodded seriously, absently, as if to a child who wanted to take a star down from the sky and give it away, when he, intensely occupied with screwing a new bulb into the ceiling fixture, said to her over his shoulder, "You'll get another umbrella."